Our next speakers are Katharina and Michaela, and they will be presenting on comparing entrepreneurial entry requirements in Silicon Valley and Berlin. Katharina and Michaela, the floor is yours. Yes.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. So as I already mentioned, our title changed a bit. So Michaela and I today are going to demystify Silicon Valley, and we are going to do this by comparing the entrepreneurial entry barriers in Berlin and Silicon Valley. So for simplicity, it's only me who's going to talk for now, but in the Q&A, Michaela might also jump in. So as you all know, Silicon Valley is like the success model of entrepreneurial ecosystems. Silicon Valley did not only bring up breakthrough innovations, but they kind of created new industrial domains. So just to give a very quick overview to bring us all the Silicon Valley spirit here, is it started in the 1930s already with Hewlett-Packard and really bringing about electrical engineering. Then we had transistors from Fairchild, microprocessors, the personal computer, the whole internet companies kind of really, many of them were born in Silicon Valley. Electric mobility got a really huge push from Tesla. Then we have social media, Apple again with the mobile internet, and also Uber with mobility. So really there are like really industrial domains coming about from this one region. So a quote I really like is from Lee in 2000, who said that for every significant advancement in information technology, a company born in Silicon Valley is a leader. So to connect this to entrepreneurial ecosystems, so the entrepreneurial ecosystems are expected to provide the resources necessary for entrepreneurship. And we could say that Silicon Valley does this particularly well. So Silicon Valley provides manifold and diverse resources for entrepreneurs and thus helps to accelerate their growth. And there are like very diverse and well-connected actors who all work together in an orchestrated manner to really jointly bring about these groundbreaking innovations through entrepreneurial activities. So now we have this very heroic image of Silicon Valley that's very present in the media and also inspires policymakers all over the world. But we would now like to shift the focus and not only look on the resources that Silicon Valley provides, but also to take the entrepreneur's perspective and to ask, how can entrepreneurs actually access these resources? So are they just kind of lying around, or are there actually some very hard barriers that you have to cross before you are able to actually make use of all these resources provided by the Silicon Valley ecosystem? So our argument is structured in a way that on the one hand, we know that resources might not be easy to access for entrepreneurs, and they also might not be comparably easy or difficult to access for different types of entrepreneurs. For example, some newer studies show that women entrepreneurs might face more severe challenges in acquiring venture capital. And also there's quite a bunch of research on investor type formation, emphasizing the difficulties entrepreneurs face when trying to actually access these resources. And we also know from entrepreneurial ecosystem research that the ecosystems might look very different across regions, which is why we were thinking about maybe these barriers or these requirements might also look different across entrepreneurial ecosystems. And this led to our research question, which is, how do entrepreneurial entry barriers vary across entrepreneurial ecosystems? Yes, and to analyze this, we decided to focus on acquiring risk investment, because so besides the universities, about which we heard quite a lot today already, we also would argue that venture capitalists and angel investors are quite powerful actors in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, because they provide not only financial capital, but also knowledge networks, and they really help to embed the entrepreneurs within the ecosystem. And but to acquire such risk investment, entrepreneurs actually have to signal legitimacy to the investors. And here we kind of draw on new institutional theory, arguing that organizations kind of need legitimacy to be able to access resources. Yes, so we really focused on the efforts taken by entrepreneurs to acquire risk investment during the early founding stages. And what we saw when analyzing our data is that the entrepreneurs have a very strong shared knowledge about what investors expect of a startup so that it is perceived as a legitimate startup. So in the following, we are really going to focus on these perceived requirements. These perceived requirements from the entrepreneur's perspective are also reflected in the interviews with the other actors and with the investors. But so for simplicity and for time reasons, we are going to focus on the entrepreneur's side here. So what we did is, as I already mentioned, we compared Silicon Valley and Berlin. So in the following, we will always have Silicon Valley in orange and Berlin in green. So it's both so Silicon Valley, as I already mentioned, very successful ecosystem, but Berlin also ranks among the top 3 in Europe. So it's not like we are comparing a very well-developed ecosystem and a very, very young one, but so Berlin is kind of on its way up, and it's already quite far. So what we did, it's a qualitative study with about 15, 16 startups in each of the ecosystems. We interviewed the entrepreneurs and talked about the efforts taken to acquire resources from the ecosystem. And we also interviewed other actors from the entrepreneurial ecosystems. I will skip the part on the data analysis for today and dive right into our findings and really let the entrepreneurs talk about how they perceive, what requirements they perceive that they have to fulfill to be able to attract investors. So I will start with one quote from a Silicon Valley startup where the entrepreneur who just recently came to Silicon Valley, so they have a very interesting outside perspective because they started in Europe and then moved to Silicon Valley. And so she explains that you have some numbers, you have team, you have technology, you have patent, and venture capitalists all look at it like check boxes. Okay, you have everything. So here she really refers to this check boxes and this very scripted way of evaluating startup that the entrepreneurs kind of learn while being embedded in this ecosystem. And this anticipation really structures their activities. And another entrepreneur, he was quite successful in acquiring investment, and he argues that this was because he already had traction. So he says we had good metrics. The revenue of the company was growing. The traction was very strong. The fact that we had so many customers already using our product has given us a lot of credibility. So what we would like to underscore here is that it's really like these check boxes and credibility issue that is very central, and that there are in Silicon Valley, there are quite many check boxes, but one of the most important ones actually is traction, which is why we want to focus on traction today. So traction basically means you have first revenue or first user numbers before you start to acquire investment capital. And this is reflected in quite many of our interviews where entrepreneurs really articulate this template characteristic of this idea that you really need traction. So by saying investors today want to see traction, you have to get to a place of real traction, and investors want to see validation of products. So the entrepreneurs really share an understanding of what is necessary to be able to actually acquire external capital. But the problem here is what one of the entrepreneurs described quite nicely is that you need money in order to get the product, but in order to get the product, you need money, you need to demonstrate the product. So you kind of have a chicken and egg problem where you kind of have to have a product and user numbers or revenue before you can actually start to acquire financial capital from the Silicon Valley ecosystem. And as another entrepreneur argues, that is part of figuring it out. That is the main thing. If you can figure it out, how to hustle, how to stay above water and continue to make progress, that's like 90% of the battle. So he describes it as incredibly important to really try to come to this point where you have the product, where you build a product without having external funding. And so what do you do in order to solve this chicken egg problem? And what quite many of our entrepreneurs did is that they were using their own savings. So as one entrepreneur explains, that you have to understand that you have to put a certain amount of your personal capital into this. And a certain amount here means something between $100,000 and $500,000, because you kind of have to build a preliminary product in Silicon Valley. And one entrepreneur puts this kind of into perspective, where he says that a lot of projects are started by ex-Googlers, ex-Facebookers, or whatever, who had pretty good salaries, and they could invest a few $100Ks into their own project. So this really shows the amount we are talking about here. So in contrast to this, when we focus on Berlin, and then we have a look at what entrepreneurs in Berlin perceive to be necessary to be able to access financial capital from the ecosystem, and this again also is reflected in our interviews with the angel investors and venture capitalists, is that the investors here invest in the team. So you basically need a convincing team. And as one of our entrepreneurs explained, that they were funded by an angel investor from the first day on. Because of course, from the first day on, you can build a convincing team. What you cannot build from the first day on is a running product. So he says that it's finding the perfect team is one of the most difficult things. Basically, if you want to raise money, the investors invest in the team, secondarily in the idea, predominantly in the team. So here it's the idea is not even as important as the team, whereas in Silicon Valley, you do not only need an idea, but you already have to have built it. So also to underscore that this idea is really shared among the entrepreneurs, this is really reflected in quite many of the interviews that we conducted, where the entrepreneurs say investors invest to 80% in the team, angel investors invest in the team, or the general rule of thumb. Here again, using these words of the rule of thumb really shows that there's a shared understanding and a template for how to be a legitimate startup. No VC invests in a lone warrior. The ideal is a group of 3 people with different competences, team complete. And one of our cases actually really anticipated this idea that you need a perfect team to acquire financial capital. And so they had to look for a CTO when negotiating with investors. So they said, okay, we were negotiating with investors and we figured now we need a CTO because they want a CTO. So we were thinking 1, 2, 3, who should do it? Let's take Tom. So this is how Tom became the CTO, very pragmatic. In the later founding process, there were quite many problems with Tom being a team member, and they wanted to kick him out, but then they already reached the next funding round and they couldn't kick him out because this would have signaled turbulences in the team, and you cannot do this. All right, so when we compare the entrepreneurial entry barriers in both ecosystems, so we have 2 quotes that really underscore the gist of all the stuff that I was talking about, where we have one Silicon Valley entrepreneur who explains that you really have to prove out your product and get to a point where you're basically in a position where you have numbers. If you're B2B, you have revenue. If you're B2C, you have 1 million users. Whereas one of the Berlin entrepreneurs explained, when do you get money? You only get money if there is a market and if you really have a business case that promises that the revenues will come at some point. Otherwise, you won't get money. So to sum it up, we see that there are very different thresholds at which companies become investable. And this is just an example with the 2 ecosystems. We, of course, would argue that there's much more facets out there in the real world. To sum up our presentation and what does this mean for ecosystem research is that we have quite unequal entrepreneurial entry barriers across entrepreneurial ecosystems. And these entry barriers exclude certain entrepreneurs. In Berlin, you kind of are excluded from the resources from the ecosystem when you are not able to find a legitimate team, which may also, of course, has some preconditions like a personal network and so on. But in Silicon Valley, entrepreneurs basically are excluded if they are unable to find 500K. And of course, we did not mention this, who have a good team, a personal track record, like having a Stanford PhD, a patent for their product, and so on. So it's not only traction. And this also is quite interesting for Silicon Valley because here entrepreneurs only start to use the resources from the ecosystem when they have passed the most uncertain founding stages. This very early stages where they are really struggling are funded by different resources that are not necessary for the reproduction of the ecosystem. A second learning that we take away here is that other entrepreneurial ecosystems actually feed into Silicon Valley. And these feeder ecosystems kind of operate as a stepping stone that helps to incubate all early stage companies. And then these companies move to Silicon Valley once their product is developed far enough. Problem is that this inhibits entrepreneurial recycling in the feeder ecosystems. We kind of found this analogy by comparing Silicon Valley kind of to the Olympic Games as a startup world. And once you enter Silicon Valley, you basically already are qualified for the Olympic Games. And you can go through this qualification phase either by starting to found in a different ecosystem and then moving to Silicon Valley, or by being locally incubated, but then you need kind of a lot of money. And last but not least, we were also wondering what this means for similarity among startups within and across entrepreneurial ecosystems, because all of them are kind of, all their activities, all their entrepreneurial actions follow these anticipations and these what they assume that investors want to see. And so this might vary across entrepreneurial ecosystems, but the feeder ecosystems might also start to emulate Silicon Valley. And also, if you are a startup and you start not in Silicon Valley, but you eventually plan to, then you have to have kind of an ambidexterity of entrepreneurs, because on the one hand, you have to fulfill the templates from your home ecosystem, but also already anticipate the templates and the legitimacy signals that Silicon Valley is expecting. And as a very open question to finish with, we were also wondering, what does this mean for innovation if basically all the ecosystem kind of follow one leading model, or kind of a feed into one model? Okay, that's it from my side. I hope I kept the time constraint. Thank you very much for your attention, and we are very much looking forward to your feedback.
Thank you, Katharina and Michaela. We have some questions already. If there are other questions, please raise your hands. We've got around 5 minutes for questions before we stop. There's been one interesting question posted by Catherine in the chat box. I'll just read the final part of it. Catherine says that she is interested in to what extent the idea shapes the team and vice versa from an identity perspective.
I think that differs across both ecosystems, because in Silicon Valley, what I saw there is it's quite often people, for example, from Stanford or from working at companies, for example, and then they have some idea and kind of look for people within their network with certain competences. So you scan your Google team whom you would like to take with you, or your Stanford research lab whom you would like to take with you when founding your startup. And in Berlin, it's more that you know some people from studying management, mostly at WHU, to bring in some cliches. And then these guys sit together and brainstorm what they could found.
Thank you. Hopefully, Catherine, that answers your question. We've got another one from Dina.
Yes, thank you for this, by the way. As someone who's studying the challenges of ecosystem, when someone says that everything is perfect, it makes me like, oh, I'd like to really go there. I just want to say something because I see this as a challenge. It's interesting for your research to try to manage, to try to apply it on the process of the growth of a business, okay? But when someone says that you should have traction of 300,000, I think, this is so much. As a venture capitalist, do you think how can you help small businesses in terms of seed capital or pre-seed? Because I think someone who has 300,000, he's definitely from growth to maturity. And something I would like to say, to be honest, in the entrepreneurship ecosystems, I hope also to try to focus in general on small management enterprises, you know, rather than those very, very big Facebook and such things that are tech giants, and especially that they can negatively affect the political career. And so we might also focus in the ecosystem on SMEs. But let me focus on this part. When you said 300,000 as a requirement, this traction, do you see it as an opportunity or do you see it as a threat, to be honest, you know, or how do you perceive it? It's very interesting, Katharina, and I'm very happy that I'm having two female researchers, Katharina and Michaela. Thank you so much, to be honest. Happy International Women's Day for you. I just want
Thank you. Yeah, so I hope that we did not only celebrate Silicon Valley, but so the idea was really to start with this heroic image and then to kind of demystify it, because we see it as a kind of critical point that is mostly overlooked, that you have a really high degree of inequality reproduced in the Silicon Valley ecosystem, because they kind of exclude everyone who has not that capital at hand and who has this. So it's maybe you already have been a successful entrepreneur or you come from a rich family. But so the Silicon Valley, if you want to found a small and medium-sized enterprise, maybe Silicon Valley is not the best place, because they really want this very high growth companies, and they would like to invest in a stage where they already know that you are really invested, that you are ready to take a loan on your house, that you're really all in, that you trust in the idea, and that you really show that this very risky idea that you're pursuing might actually have a customer space. And I actually think that this is very much too much celebrated as a great model, and that the negative sides are really considered to too little extent. Yes, that's.
Thank you. And we've got two other questions. I think this will be it. So first to Aaron, and then we will have a question from Shiri.
Yes, thank you very much. I was also actually surprised seeing this about the Silicon Valley. So I just have one question, basically. How did you recruit the startups in your sample? And do you think there could be some sampling issues? Or are you sure, so to say, that this is representative somehow? I'm just wondering, because here from Munich, they invest in teams who have no idea, who have nothing. Yeah. And they just get 600,000 euros from the VC. So, yeah.
I would say that there could be some bias, because when I started, I went to Silicon Valley, and I'm not a Stanford professor, and I'm not, you know, I'm not in this network. But if there is a bias in my sample, then it's from the down part, you know, like then I would. So the bias would actually go more to the less wealthy entrepreneurs. And I think the ones that I might have missed in my sampling strategy would be the ones that come with even more capital. Because, yeah.
Thank you. Shiri?
Yes, hi, thank you, Katharina and Michaela. Really nice presentation, and I like the feedback, and want to echo that everything you said about we shouldn't be copying other models is very, very important. But I think for the discussion of the ecosystem, and maybe a little bit echoing what Aaron was saying, I have a question about if you measure the availability of human capital. So you assume that there's, you know, the Silicon Valley firms are not, you know, they're not looking for team members because, you know, the most important thing is the capital. Because the question is, maybe there's no issues of human capital, right? There's availability of human capital, and the same thing about the funding, right? So the funding level is much higher in Silicon Valley because there is a lot of startup capital, right?
Yeah, so I did not want to say that they are not looking on the team. So the team also is important. So if you take a more, we had to kick some stuff out due to time constraints. But if you really have a deep dive, another very important thing in Silicon Valley is what they refer to as track record. So it's not only the team composition. So in Berlin, it's basically you have all the skills and the people are kind of convincing, but in Silicon Valley, it's even more on the track record of the entrepreneurs, like having a Stanford degree, having have had exits before. So but I would say that even the evaluation of the team members have a higher threshold, and that you have to have achieved much more during your career before you become a legitimate Silicon Valley entrepreneur. But traction is even more prominent.
Right, so that goes into the complexity of the network, right? So the networks in the ecosystem networks in Silicon Valley are way more complex, deeper, stronger. You have way more players, right? So that changes a little bit. And maybe that's a way for you to connect with the ecosystem literature a little bit.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Thank you for the questions, and thank you for being here. I will give the floor to Fumi, who will conclude the session.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks very much for everyone for staying on, and big thanks for Dan for organizing and sort of sharing. And just sort of, I think it was really good because the title of the workshop, the first one today, is Spatial and Institutional Dimensions of Entrepreneurial Ecosystems. And I think all the speakers covered this perfectly. So thanks to Andrew and Michael, Cornelius, and Michael, Katharina, and Michaela. Super, thanks very much again. And I'd like to introduce the second workshop, which is next week, same time. And it's great because Silly is here. And then Ben Spiegel, my colleague from Edinburgh, is here. And Rob Huggins, one of the organizers and from University of Cardiff, will be speaking next week. And he's here today now. And we'll have Rhiannon Poo from Lund University. So it's going to be really interesting one. And we'll be looking at policies, actors, and outcomes in entrepreneurial ecosystems. So thank you very much for joining us today, and hope to see you again next week. Thank you.